Hey there, Matt Jertson from Better Everyday Studios. Today we are going to be talking about the Tomorrow War and how you can learn lessons from this sci-fi movie to improve your employee onboarding experience. Don't believe me? Stick around to find out. When you started at your current company, was it kind of like you were dropped off in the air and left to your own devices to just figure out where to land? I used to run onboarding at several companies, including SpaceX, and you would be amazed at the stories I have heard about employee onboarding experiences. No support, no training. It seems like the norm is people just getting kind of dropped into the deep end. Strangely enough, that's actually not very different from the premise of the beginning of The Tomorrow War. If you've never seen the movie, don't worry, there shouldn't be any spoilers here. The premise is that 30 years in the future, there's a major global war that humanity is losing against a bunch of aliens that have invaded. And for help, they have traveled back in time 30 years to try to enlist soldiers to bring back with them into the future to keep fighting.
We are you. 30 years in the future.
Now, forgetting all of the time travel rules that premise seems to violate, there are actually some great lessons that we can learn from this movie. And if you watch closely, there's key things that we can learn not to do when onboarding employees into any organization. Great onboarding actually starts before the onboarding process, before they are even hired. I mean, if you hire the wrong candidate, is onboarding really going to help? Probably not. So the first thing that we all need to do is make very clear what the expectations are for any role. And in fact, that's something that most companies probably skip over.
You're gonna feel a cold sensation?
What is this test? What are you testing? What are you whispering?
Mr. Forrester, you've been elevated to Active 2 status.
What?
You meet all requirements for conscription.
What are the requirements for conscription? A pulse?
Especially in a growing company, hiring needs to happen fast. And so it's understandable that many jobs get posted without really clear job descriptions. But it's the responsibility of every person in the process, whether that's HR, learning and development, recruiting, or the hiring manager, to make sure that criteria are as clear as possible so that the candidate knows whether or not to apply for this job. The hiring manager knows if it's the right person for the job. Everyone in the interview knows what they're hiring against. If you don't have those criteria clearly laid out and extremely transparent to everyone involved in the hiring process, you're really just making it harder for yourself in the long run. You're making it much more likely that you're going to bring in the wrong candidate and then have to suffer the consequences down the road, whether that's a lot of time spent trying to train them for something that they've never done before, or letting them go and starting the whole hiring process all over again. Once you make sure you have the right candidate, you also need to be extremely clear with that candidate about who you are as an organization.
Okay, but why don't we have pictures or videos, would help us to know what we're up against?
The consensus was that if the public saw what they'd face when they reached the future, it would become virtually impossible to fill that hangar.
Okay, cool. Next time someone asks that, you should probably just lie.
I know several companies that, how should I say, hide who they are. During the interview process, they promise lots of flexibility and work-life balance, when on the inside, they're really demanding 60 hours a week. Or they say they're fine with remote work, except none of the managers really enjoy remote work and they want you in the office all the time. It's not that any of these particular work practices are wrong, it's just that you need to be clear about it. You need to be as transparent as possible about what your culture is, who you are, how you like to work. That way, rather than trying to fit a round peg into a square hole and everybody being kind of frustrated, you make sure to essentially screen out candidates that aren't going to fit within your type of organization. Again, Every organization doesn't need to be for everyone. You can decide to run your organization how you want it. But the problem comes when you mislead people during the hiring process. They disrupt their entire life, come to work for you, and then find it's not exactly what they were expecting. And so if you want to help yourself, help the organization, and help the people you are trying to hire, just as early as possible, be as upfront as possible about what the culture is going to look like. That's one of the reasons why Netflix was so successful in the release of their culture deck. I actually interviewed at Netflix once, didn't get the job. That's okay. I really appreciated how much they talked about culture during the interview process. They asked me questions about it to make sure I knew what I was going to be getting into by joining their organization. That way, they essentially pre-screened people so that they could limit the attrition after hire. A good onboarding experience, a good hiring experience minimizes the attrition after, that short-term attrition where 30 days after hire, 60 days after hire, people are leaving. That's the kind of stuff you want to avoid. Now that you have hired the right people who can flourish in your organization, you have to give them the tools to be successful. You do that, right?
What's going on? I thought we had 7 days.
The world doesn't end on a schedule.
We're not ready for any kind of deployment. We don't even know what we're going on.
I'm convinced that just about every hiring manager thinks that just about every hire is critical to the survival of the organization. They want to hire them yesterday, bring them in the middle of the week, skip orientation. You know what? It's not that critical, at least not 99% of the time. The whole point of orientation is to standardize it and make sure that it brings people in a way that gets them prepared for their job so they're not stuck floundering and trying to find their way on their own. We need to make sure that you give them the tools necessary so that they are successful within the organization after they start. And that's going to involve coming up with a standard process where you sit down and think through everything that a new hire needs to know. I often think of onboarding as getting across the 3 C's for the organization, for every single employee that is starting. You have to give them the context of the organization, who our customers are, what our products are, how their role fits into all of that. After you give them the context, you have to teach them the culture so that you can reinforce what you showed them during the hiring process, but really help them understand how that culture comes to life. And finally, you want to build connection between them and all of the people who already work in the organization. Who are the key people that they need to know? Holding get-togethers so that they can meet people who are being hired at the same time as them, but also meet all of the people who already work in the organization. If you skip all of that, you're really just hurting yourself in the long run. It might seem good to get somebody to work right away, but chances are they're not going to be as effective as if you just waited, whether it's a day, a week, whatever your standard onboarding process is. The goal of that onboarding process is to make someone more effective once they get to their team. If you skip over that process, all of the work of teaching the context, teaching the culture, building connection now lives with the hiring manager and that team, and that's probably something that they are not prepared to do. Even if they're not prepared to pick up all of that, there are some very important things that every hiring manager and hiring team needs to be prepared for. They need to be able to accept the new hires and get them started, and hopefully it looks a little bit better than this. Fair warning, this scene's a little graphic. Once employees are actually sent out into their work area, you need to make sure they have a good place to land. Does the hiring manager know they're starting? Is there someone to meet with them? Is there a training plan or a set of initial things they need to get done? The more every area has that prepared for them, the more likely that new hire is going to be excited when they start. Remember, The day of, the first couple weeks after hiring, that's probably the most engaged an employee is going to be during their entire tenure at your organization. So you want to make the most of it by making sure that there is a true starting plan for every employee in every single team. So what do you think? Is starting at your company anything like getting sucked through a wormhole 30 years into the future to try to fight aliens? Well, it's probably not that bad, but there's probably still room for improvement using these 4 steps. First, make sure hiring criteria are clear and understood by everyone involved in the hiring process. Second, during the hiring process, make sure to be completely transparent about your culture so candidates know the kind of organization they're joining. Third, make sure to give adequate time and resources to get people up to speed during the initial orientation process. Don't skip it. That way they can hit the ground running when they get to their final team. And fourth, for every team, make sure there's a good place for them to land with someone to meet them, some initial instructions to get them started. That way they have the best hiring and starting experience possible. This is just the beginning of some of the simple steps your organization can take to improve employee training. If you want to hear more, make sure to subscribe to this channel. We're putting out a lot of content to help you create simple solutions for employee training.